My name is Garcia, and for a long time, I was a woman who lived in the shadows of a man I thought was my world. I stood on a cold, narrow cobblestone street in a small Italian town, watching the taillights of my husband's car disappear into the dark, accompanied only by the echo of his friends' cruel laughter. They thought leaving me stranded was a joke, a lesson in my dependence on them. They told me to see how she gets back, never imagining that I wouldn't return. But what they didn't know was that in that moment of abandonment, they weren't leaving me behind. They were finally letting me go. The taillights were two bleeding gashes in the velvet dark of the Italian twilight. I watched them, my eyes wide and unblinking, as they grew smaller, flickering like dying embers before finally winking out around the serrated edge of a stone building. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a physical weight, a heavy, suffocating shroud that settled over the narrow, cobblestone street of a town whose name I had only heard whispered in Gabriel's impatient breath. The air in that small Italian village felt like shattered glass. Every time I drew a breath, it felt as though the shards were cutting into my lungs, cold and unforgiving. I stood there, my mouth still half open, the final syllable of my plea hanging uselessly in the humid air. "Gabriel," I whispered, the sound so pathetic it made my own skin crawl. There was no answer. Only the distant, rhythmic thrum of a Vespa somewhere blocks away and the mocking phantom echo of laughter. It was Pete's raucous bray first, followed by Marco's high-pitched wheeze, and then, the sound that truly broke the world, Gabriel's deep melodic baritone. It was a laugh I had once found comforting, a sound I had associated with home and safety. Tonight it was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. The argument at the cafe had been, in Gabriel's eyes, a scene. In reality, it was me quietly asking him to slow down on the third bottle of Chianti. His college friends, the boys who lived in a permanent state of arrested development, had collectively groaned. Pete had leaned back, his face flushed a gin blossom red, and sneered. "She's got the leash on tight today, Gabe. You going to let her tuck you in before the sun goes down?" Gabriel's eyes had turned into chips of flint. He hated being perceived as weak, especially by the men he so desperately sought to impress. He didn't defend me. He never did. Instead, he turned his practiced architect's gaze on me, the gaze he used to find flaws in a blueprint, and said, "You're being a bore, Garcia. If you're so worried about the hotel, why don't you find your own way back?" I thought it was a bluff. I thought it was just the wine talking. When they stood up to leave, I followed them to the car, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Gabriel, stop. You've had too much. Let's just call a taxi," I had said, reaching for his arm. He had shaken me off as if I were a stray hair on his bespoke linen jacket. "Your purse has your passport, right?" he had asked, his voice chillingly sober for a man who had just finished a bottle of wine. "Yes, but..." "Then you'll figure it out. You're so smart, always telling everyone what to do. Figure out how to get to Florence without me." Then came the door slams, the ignition, and the laughter. That god-awful, braying laughter that signaled they thought this was the joke of the century. Leave the nagging wife behind. Teach her a lesson. Let her walk in her designer heels until she learns to keep her mouth shut. I looked down at my feet. The sandals were beautiful, strappy, gold-toned, bought specifically for this trip because Gabriel wanted me to look effortlessly chic for his friends. Now they were instruments of torture against the uneven stones. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the joke began to reveal its true jagged shape. I reached into my small clutch, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. I pulled out my phone. 27 calls to Gabriel. All ignored. Messages to Pete and Marco. Read but no reply. A notification popped up. A social media post from Marco. A blurry photo of the three of them in the car, middle fingers raised to the camera, with the caption, "Freedom tastes like Italian wind. Sorry, not sorry. Hashtag grooming the wife, hashtag the great escape." The visceral shock hit me then. A wave of nausea so powerful I had to lean against a cold, moss-covered wall. This wasn't a drunken impulse. This was a calculated humiliation. Gabriel had been planning this or something like it for years. He had spent our decade of marriage slowly eroding my foundations, making me doubt my instincts, and isolating me from the woman who once ran her own design firm. He had turned me into a supportive wife, which was just his polite term for an ornament he could manipulate. The town, which had seemed so picturesque hours ago with its flower-filled balconies and warm amber lights, now felt like a labyrinth designed to swallow me whole. I looked at the locals sitting at the sidewalk tables nearby. They watched me with a mix of pity and practiced indifference. To them, I was just another beautiful American woman whose husband was a pig. They had seen this play before. I checked my wallet. €80. $37. A single lipstick. A mirror. My credit cards? Gabriel had them. Let me carry those, darling, your clutch is too small and I don't want you losing them, he had said with that charming, predatory smile this morning. He hadn't been being helpful. He had been disarming me. He had stripped me of my financial oxygen before abandoning me in a place where I didn't speak the language. The hollow feeling expanded in my chest, a dark void where my heart used to be. I thought about the life we had in Boston, the brownstone, the curated dinners, the perfect marriage that was actually a prison of high-end finishes and low-grade emotional abuse. I realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that I wasn't just stranded in Italy. I was stranded in a life that didn't belong to me. The sky turned a bruised purple, then a deep, unforgiving black. I began to walk. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay in the spot where the laughter still seemed to vibrate in the air. I am Garcia Davis, I whispered to the empty street, trying to find the woman I used to be. I am 34 years old. I am an interior designer. I am alone. The word tasted like copper. Alone. For years, that word had been my greatest fear. Gabriel had used it as a threat. Where would you go without me, Lexi? Who would have you? You're lucky I put up with your moods. I stopped in front of a small, dimly lit shop window. My reflection looked back at me. A woman in a designer dress, her hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless despite the tears. I looked like a doll. A pretty expensive, discarded doll. In that moment, the sadness didn't vanish, but it shifted. It sharpened. It became a weapon. If Gabriel wanted to see how I got back, I would show him. But I wouldn't go back to the brownstone. I wouldn't go back to being the supportive wife. The echo of the laughter still rang in my ears, but for the first time it didn't make me want to cry. It made me want to burn his world to the ground. I turned away from the direction the car had gone. I headed toward a small sign that pointed toward a pension. My heels clicked against the stones, a steady, defiant beat. The betrayal was complete, but the story, my story, was only just beginning. Gabriel thought he was teaching me a lesson about dependence. He was wrong. He was teaching me exactly how much I could survive without him. And as I walked into the darkness of the unknown, I realized that the shattered glass in the air was no longer cutting me. I was walking on it, and I was going to make sure that the next time Gabriel saw me, he'd be the one bleeding. The glow of my smartphone was a fading ember in the palm of my hand, the light flickering as if it were gasping for air. 3%. The number stared back at me, a tiny digital death sentence. In a world where connection was oxygen, I was suffocating. I watched the percentage drop to 2% as I tried one last time to refresh my location. But the signal was a ghost, haunted by the stone walls of the ancient buildings that pressed in on me from either side. I leaned against a cold iron lamppost, the metal biting into my shoulder through the thin silk of my dress. I reached into my clutch, my fingers grazing the meager contents of my life. I pulled them out, laying them on the flat top of a stone ledge like a funeral offering. €80. Two €20 notes, slightly crumpled, and a handful of smaller bills. 37 American dollars that were currently useless paper. My passport. The blue cover scarred with a scratch from when Gabriel had tossed it onto the dresser in Boston. A single tube of ruby slipper lipstick. A compact mirror. This was it. This was the sum total of Garcia Davis. The stinging shame washed over me, hot and corrosive. It wasn't just the lack of money. It was the realization of how calculated my poverty was. This morning, as we dressed in our sun-drenched suite in Florence, Gabriel had reached for my hand with that smooth, practiced tenderness. "Give me your cards, Lexi," he'd said, his voice like warm honey. "That tiny purse is already bursting, and you know how the pickpockets are in these smaller towns. I'll keep them safe in my wallet. One less thing for you to worry about." I had smiled and kissed his cheek. I had thanked him for being so thoughtful. I hadn't seen the tether he was wrapping around my throat. I hadn't realized he was performing a financial castration, ensuring that if his joke went as planned, I would be utterly, hopelessly paralyzed. He hadn't just left me. He had disarmed me. He had stripped me of my agency and left me to beg in a language I didn't know. The cobblestone streets, which had looked so authentic and charming in the travel brochures Gabriel had curated, now felt predatory. Every shadow in a doorway seemed to stretch toward me. Every distant shout from a group of men sounded like a threat. The romantic golden hue of the street lamps had turned into a jaundiced, sickly yellow that cast long, distorted shadows of my own broken form against the walls. I began to walk again, my gold heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm. Each step was a needle of pain shooting up my calves. I was a designer. I knew the cost of these shoes. $600 for a pair of Jimmy Choos, and they couldn't even carry me half a mile without drawing blood. I stopped, pulled them off, and felt the freezing grit-covered stones against my bare soles. It was a different kind of pain, raw, grounding, and strangely honest. I turned a corner and the scent of yeast and charred flour hit me. It was a cloying, heavy smell that normally would have been comforting, but in my state of desperation, it felt like an insult. Above the bakery was a sagging wooden sign, "Pension." I pushed open the door. A bell chimed, a lonely, thin sound. The air inside was thick with the smell of old dust and floor wax. Behind a small, scarred wooden counter sat a woman whose face was a map of 1,000 Greek and Italian winters. She didn't look up from her knitting. "Prego," she muttered. I need a room," I said, my voice cracking. I cleared my throat, trying to summon the ghost of the confident woman who had once commanded boardrooms. "A room? For one night?" She looked up then, her eyes sharp as needles. She took in my disheveled hair, the expensive silk dress stained with sweat and dust, and my bare blackened feet. I saw the judgment flicker in her gaze, followed by a flicker of something that might have been pity, though it was too sharp to be kind. €70, she said in broken English. "Advance." My heart plummeted. 70? That would leave me with 10. €10 to feed myself, to find a way out, to survive. I looked at the €80 in my hand. It was a hostage negotiation with my own future. "Please," I whispered, sliding the notes across the counter. Is there a phone I can use? A charger?" She took the money, her thick fingers snapping the bills tight, and handed me a heavy iron key with a faded red tassel. "No phone. No charger. Room 3. Up." The room was a cell. A narrow bed with a thin, lumpy mattress, a single flat pillow, and a sink in the corner that leaked a steady, rhythmic drip, 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 that sounded like a ticking clock counting down the end of my sanity. The wallpaper was peeling in long, jaundiced strips, revealing the gray stone beneath. I crossed to the bed and sat down, the springs groaning in protest. I pulled my phone out one last time. 1%. I opened my messages. I saw a notification from a group chat, the boys' trip chat that Gabriel had accidentally added me to months ago and forgotten to remove. "Pete. Man, you should have seen her face. Like a lost puppy. Marco. She'll be crying at the cafe until morning. We should have bet on how long it takes her to call her daddy. Gabriel. Let her wait. She needs to understand that I'm the one who provides the map. Without me, she doesn't even know which way is north." The screen went black. The silence of the room crashed over me. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp outside the window. I felt the calculated humiliation of it all, the way he had turned my life into a lesson, a way to break my spirit until I was nothing but a hollow vessel for his ego. I didn't cry. The tears felt too expensive, a luxury I couldn't afford to waste. Instead, I began rationing hope. I sat on that narrow bed and began to plan. I thought about my wedding ring, the 2-carat diamond that sat heavy on my finger. Gabriel had bought it to replace the modest band we'd started with, calling the first one embarrassing for a man of his stature. To him it was a brand. To me tonight it was a weapon. I realized then that I was tethered to a dead thing, my marriage. Gabriel thought he had left me in a small town to rot. He thought he had left a helpless girl who would crawl back the moment he whistled. He didn't realize that by taking away my money, my phone, and my perfect life, he had accidentally taken away the only things he used to control me. I reached out and touched the cold, leaking porcelain of the sink. The water was freezing. I splashed it on my face, scrubbing away the expensive foundation, the designer mascara, the mask of the supportive wife. In the mirror above the sink, a stranger looked back. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her skin was pale, and her jaw was set in a way I hadn't seen in a decade. She looked haunted, yes. She looked desperate. But beneath the desperation, there was a flicker of something cold and sharp. I would sleep in this dingy room. I would listen to the bakery downstairs begin its work in the pre-dawn hours. And tomorrow, I would sell the only piece of Gabriel I had left. I lay down on the bed, my bare feet tucked under the thin quilt. The smell of bread began to rise through the floorboards, warm, yeasty, and mocking. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me. The echo of Gabriel's laughter finally fading, replaced by the steady, icy beat of a heart that was learning how to survive on nothing but spite. The morning light in Italy is supposed to be a benediction, a golden wash of hope that wakes the soul. To me, pouring through the cracked shutters of my room above the bakery, it felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. I woke with my hand clenched in a fist, my knuckles white, protecting the only thing Gabriel had left me. The 2-carat diamond was a cold, hard lump against my palm, a crystalline reminder of the gilded cage I had called a home for a decade. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, my skin sallow in the morning glare. I looked at the ring. It was a masterpiece of engineering. A D-color, internally flawless stone set in a platinum band that Gabriel had upgraded on our 5th anniversary. He had dismissed my original modest wedding band as sentimental clutter that didn't fit the brand of a top-tier architect's wife. This ring wasn't a promise of love. It was a badge of his tax bracket. It was a shackle made of light. The walk to the town center was a blur of searing heat and mounting grief-stricken resolve. My bare feet, now calloused and bruised from the previous night's trek, felt every jagged edge of the cobblestones. I was still wearing the silk dress, now wrinkled and smelling of desperation, but I carried myself with a rigidity that kept the curious glances of the locals at bay. I wasn't a tourist anymore. I was a refugee of a private war. I found the shop tucked away in a shadowed alleyway, far from the vibrant cafes and designer boutiques. The sign above the door was small and tarnished, Oro e Pegni, golden pledges. I stood before the cramped, dusty window for a long time. Behind the glass lay a chaotic graveyard of other people's forevers. Tarnished silver spoons, heavy gold chains, and watches that had stopped counting time years ago. It was a mausoleum of misfortune. I felt a wave of nausea. To step inside was to admit that my life had become one of these discarded fragments. It was the final severance. The bell above the door gave a tired, metallic wheeze as I entered. The shop smelled of ozone, old paper, and the metallic tang of unfulfilled dreams. An elderly man with skin like parchment and spectacles thick as bottle glass looked up from a jeweler's loupe. He didn't say a word. He just waited, his eyes clinical, seeing me for exactly what I was. A woman at the end of her rope. I reached for my left hand. My fingers were swollen from the heat and the crying, and the platinum band felt like it had fused with my bone. I twisted. The metal bit into my skin, resisting the separation. It was as if the ring itself was a loyal soldier of Gabriel's, refusing to let go of its captive. I felt a sudden sharp memory of the day he put it on my finger, the way he had smiled at the guests, not at me. He had looked so proud of the sparkle, so satisfied with the price tag. With a final agonizing wrench that broke the skin of my knuckle, the ring came free. I placed it on the black velvet pad on the counter. The diamond caught a stray beam of light, shattering it into 1,000 mocking rainbows. It was beautiful. It was expensive. And it was utterly worthless to my heart. How much? I asked, my voice a jagged shadow of itself. The shopkeeper picked up the ring with a pair of tweezers. He didn't look at the craftsmanship or the history. He didn't ask about the vows it represented. He saw carats, clarity, and the resale value of platinum. He looked through his loupe, his breath hitching slightly as he realized the quality of the stone. 4,000 euros, he said, his voice flat. 4,000. I gasped. It was appraised at 45,000 in Boston. The man shrugged, a slow, indifferent movement. In Boston it is jewelry. Here it is a risk. I have to find a buyer. I have to hide it from the tax man. 4,000. Cash. Now. It was a cold transaction. A brutal mathematical equation that valued 10 years of my life at less than 10% of its market price. The stinging injustice of it made my vision blur. Gabriel had spent more on a single dinner party to impress his partners. But as I looked at the man, I realized he was offering me more than money. He was offering me the distance between me and Gabriel. For €1,000 could buy a lot of distance. "I'll take it," I said. He disappeared into a back room, the heavy thud of a safe echoing through the shop. I stood there, staring at the empty space on the velvet pad where the ring had been. I felt a strange physical sensation in my hand, a phantom weight. My ring finger felt unnaturally light, almost buoyant, as if a lead weight had been lifted from my soul. But beneath that lightness was a raw, stinging ache. It was the feeling of a limb that had been amputated to save the rest of the body. The man returned and counted out the bills. Crisp, colorful notes that smelled of ink and possibility. I stuffed them into my clutch, no longer caring about the ruby slip or lipstick or the designer labels. This wasn't luxury, this was fuel. "America? Home?" the shopkeeper asked as I turned to leave. I paused at the door, the sunlight outside blindingly bright. I thought about the life waiting for me in Boston, the pitying looks from my mother, the "I told you so's" from my friends who had seen the cracks Gabriel had so carefully plastered over. I thought about the woman who had walked into this shop, a woman who defined herself by the man who had discarded her. "No," I said, "the word tastes like iron and honey. Not America." I stepped out onto the street. The air was still hot, the stones were still sharp, but the crushing pressure in my lungs had eased. I looked down at my hand. There was a pale, untanned circle where the ring had sat for years, a scar of white skin in a sea of brown. It was a mark of where I had been. The severance was complete. I had sold the ghost of my past to fund a future I couldn't yet see. I began to walk toward the bus station, my pace faster now, the phantom weight of the ring replaced by the very real weight of the cash in my bag. Gabriel thought he had left me with nothing. He didn't realize that by stripping me of his protection, he had forced me to find my own. I wasn't going back to be his accessory. I was going to disappear into the blue of the Mediterranean, and by the time he realized I was gone for good, I would be a woman he no longer recognized. The supportive wife was buried in that dusty pawn shop. Garcia was finally terrifyingly free. The bus station was a concrete throat, swallowing the desperate and spitting out the restless. It smelled of scorched diesel, stale tobacco, and the collective anxiety of people who had somewhere to be but no easy way to get there. I stood in line, my hand clenching the strap of a cheap, canvas duffel bag I'd bought for €10, a pathetic replacement for the Toomey luggage currently sitting in a hotel suite in Florence, filled with silk slips and designer blazers I no longer owned. When I reached the ticket window, the agent, a man with deep-set eyes and skin the color of old mahogany, didn't even look up. "Where?" he barked. I paused. My finger hovered over my phone's contact list one last time. Mother. One call and the cavalry would arrive. One call and I would be cocooned in a business-class seat, whisked back to a world where my biggest problem was choosing the right hors d'oeuvres for a gallery opening. But I could hear her voice already. "I told you he had a temper, Garcia. I told you men like Gabriel don't change. You should have managed him better." Managed him. As if he were a budget or a renovation project, not a man who enjoyed the sound of his own power. "Greece," I said, the word feeling like a secret I was telling myself for the first time. "The furthest coastal village you have a route to. Somewhere south." He grunted and slid a thin, flimsy paper ticket across the glass. It cost a fraction of what I'd once spent on a single bottle of wine, but as I held it, it felt heavier than any piece of gold I'd ever worn. It was a permit to be anonymous. The bus was a rattling iron beast that smelled of unwashed skin and sour oranges. I found a seat in the back, leaning my head against the vibrating glass of the window as we pulled out of the station. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the interior lights of the bus flickered on, a sickly fluorescent hum, and my own reflection began to materialize in the window. I stared at myself and for a moment I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked translucent. It wasn't just the lack of makeup or the tangled hair. It was as if the last 10 years had been a process of slow, systematic erasure. I thought back to the woman I was at 24, a rising star in a boutique design firm, a woman who spoke in exclamation points and wasn't afraid to take up space in a room. Then came Gabriel. At first, his suggestions felt like guidance. Maybe don't wear that red, darling, it's a bit loud for the partners. Do we really need you working 40 hours a week? My schedule is so demanding, I need you here to keep the house running. Slowly, the we became a he. My career didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whisper, a gradual diminishing until I was nothing more than the shadow he cast on the wall. I had spent a decade making myself smaller, quieter, and more pliable, all to maintain the peace. I had mistaken his control for protection, and my own disappearance for devotion. I had become a ghost in my own life, hovering at the edges of his success, ensuring his world was beautiful while mine was turning to gray. The realization was a tectonic shift in my soul. The ground of my identity, which I thought was solid, was actually a series of fault lines held together by the glue of his ego. And now the glue had dried and cracked. As the bus wound through the dark Italian countryside toward the ferry terminal at Brindisi, the physical exhaustion began to set in, but it was laced with a dangerous spark of freedom. Every mile we traveled south was a mile further from the woman who said yes to everything. Every bump in the road was a reminder that I was no longer being managed. I watched the small flickering lights of Italian farmhouses pass by. People were in there, living lives of routine and safety. I envied them, and yet I was terrified of ever being safe in that way again. Safety had been my prison. We boarded the ferry at midnight. The Adriatic Sea was a vast, obsidian mirror, reflecting nothing but the cold stars above. I stood on the deck, the salt spray stinging my face, watching the wake of the ship churn white against the darkness. I thought about Gabriel, probably asleep in a high thread count bed, confident that I was huddled in some Italian police station, weeping and waiting for his inevitable, heroic return. He would play the role of the long-suffering husband perfectly, telling his friends how he had to go back and rescue her from her own stupidity. He didn't know I was on a boat. He didn't know I had sold his brand. He didn't know that the woman he thought he had broken had actually been set free by the very blow he intended to shatter her with. I retreated to a plastic bench in the passenger lounge, my body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt as though it had reached my marrow. I closed my eyes, the rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines lulling me into a fitful sleep. In my dreams I was designing a room, not for a client, not for Gabriel, but for myself. It had no walls. It was made of light and salt air, and there was no one there to tell me the colors were too loud. When I woke, the sky was a pale, bruised violet. The Greek coastline was a jagged silhouette against the dawn. I felt a surge of melancholy liberation. I was a woman with no home, no husband, and no plan. I was a fugitive from a life that had tried to kill my spirit. The bus journey resumed on the other side of the water. We climbed through mountains where goats stood like sentinels on the cliffs, and descended into valleys where the air smelled of wild thyme and ancient dust. My fellow passengers changed, old women in black headscarves, young men with sun-bronzed skin and calloused hands. No one looked at me twice. To them I was just another traveler, a face in the crowd, a soul in transit. By the time the bus reached the final stop, a tiny whitewashed village clinging to the edge of a cliff above the Aegean, I was more exhausted than I had ever been in my life. I stepped off the bus, my legs shaking, my canvas bag slung over my shoulder. The heat hit me like a physical blow, but it was a dry, honest heat. I looked out over the water, which was a blue so intense it looked like it had been poured from a bottle of ink. I was here. I was anonymous. I was diminished to almost nothing, but for the first time in 10 years the nothing belonged to me. I took a breath, the air filling the spaces where Gabriel's voice used to be. It was quiet. It was terrifying. It was the first day of the rest of my life, and as I started walking toward the sound of the sea, I knew I would never make myself small again. The Greek sun was not a light. It was an interrogation. It beat down with a relentless white-hot intensity that stripped away the last of my pretenses, melting the resolve I had so carefully forged on that long bus ride south. In the village of Plaka, or something that sounded like a cough and a sigh, the air was a thick, dust-choked curtain that caught in my throat, tasting of scorched earth and ancient salt. I had been walking for hours. My canvas bag, once light with hope, now felt like a leaden anchor dragging me toward the soil. My Boston lady hands were cramped from gripping the strap, and my feet, those delicate, pampered things I had once spent hundreds to maintain, were a map of raw blisters and throbbing heat. I had left the paved road long ago, driven by a primal need to escape the eyes of the villagers, to find a place where I could simply stop being seen. I wandered into the outskirts of the village, where the whitewashed houses gave way to the gnarled, silver-green sea of the olive groves. Here the world changed. The cicadas provided a shimmering wall of sound, a rhythmic electric drone that vibrated in my very bones. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted into agonized, beautiful shapes, as if they were frozen in a centuries-long struggle to reach the sky. I stopped under the shadow of a particularly massive tree, its canopy a lacework of silver leaves that flickered like coins in the breeze. I tried to swallow, but my throat was a desert. My water bottle had been empty since mid-morning, and the edges of my vision were beginning to fray, curling into dark, ragged fringes. This is it, I thought, a strange, hysterical giggle bubbling up in my chest. Gabriel was right. I am a designer who can't even design a walk to a well. I am an architect's wife who is crumbling because the roof is too far away. But as the thought formed, it was followed by a wave of profound, terrifying surrender. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even afraid. I was just done. I had spent 10 years holding up the walls of a marriage that was built on sand. I had spent 10 years performing Garcia, a woman who was always composed, always elegant, always supportive. The effort of maintaining that architecture had finally exhausted my structural integrity. My knees didn't just buckle, they gave up. The ground rushed up to meet me, not with a blow but with a hard, sun-warmed embrace. I felt the dry grass scratch my cheek, the smell of wild thyme and parched earth filling my senses. I let my bag slip from my fingers. I let my head rest against the dirt. The shimmering heat haze above me seemed to solidify, turning the silver leaves into a ceiling of stars. Let the earth have me, I whispered into the dust. I don't want to be Garcia anymore. I don't want to be anyone's wife. I don't want to be anyone's anything. This was the rock bottom. Not the street in Italy, not the pawn shop, not the lonely bus. This moment, lying face down in a foreign grove, waiting for the sun to finish what Gabriel started, was the absolute end of the woman I had been. I closed my eyes, the cicada song rising to a deafening crescendo, and then silence. I don't know how long I was under. Time in the grove felt fluid, a river of gold and shadow that didn't follow the ticking of a clock. I dreamed of rain. I dreamed of a voice that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves, calling a name that wasn't mine. I was awakened by a touch. It wasn't the demanding, possessive touch of Gabriel, nor the polite, distant touch of a doctor. These were hands that felt like the bark of the trees themselves, rough, calloused, and deeply, anciently warm. I felt a cool dampness on my forehead, a piece of cloth that smelled of lavender and well water. Cory Mau, Cory Mau. The voice was a low, melodic rasp. I forced my eyes open, the light stabbing at my retinas. A face swam into focus, framed against the blinding blue of the sky. It was a face etched by the wind and the sun, a landscape of deep lines and sunspots that spoke of a lifetime of honest labor. Her eyes were the color of dark honey, filled with a weathered grace that didn't demand an explanation. This was Lorena. She was kneeling in the dust beside me, her black dress faded to charcoal by 1,000 washings. She didn't look shocked to find a half-dead American woman in her grove. She looked as if she had been expecting me, as if the earth had finally delivered something it had been holding on to for too long. She lifted my head with a surprising sinewy strength and pressed a tin cup to my lips. The water was metallic and bracingly cold. I choked on the first sip, my body recoiling from the sudden influx of life. But she held me steady, murmuring words in a language that sounded like the sea hitting the rocks. I drank until the cup was dry, the water blooming in my chest like a miracle. Evcharisto, I wheezed, the only Greek word I had managed to memorize. Lorena smiled then, a slow, radiant movement that transformed her face into a map of kindness. She touched my cheek with a thumb that felt like fine-grit sandpaper. She pointed to herself. Lorena. Then she pointed to me, her eyebrows rising in a silent question. Garcia, I said. Felt strange to say it. It felt like a name I was trying on for the first time. She nodded, as if the name suited the dust and the heat. She stood up, reaching down to offer me her hand. I looked at it, the palm broad, the fingernails stained with the juice of the earth, the skin a testament to survival. I reached up and took it. As she pulled me to my feet, the world tilted, but she didn't let me fall. She tucked my arm under hers, her small frame surprisingly solid, a human sanctuary in the middle of the wilderness. She picked up my cheap canvas bag and slung it over her own shoulder as if it weighed nothing at all. We began to walk, a slow, halting procession through the silver trees. She didn't ask where I came from. She didn't ask why I was wearing a silk dress in an olive grove. She simply guided me toward a small stone farmhouse nestled at the top of the hill, its white walls glowing like a pearl in the afternoon light. As we reached the porch, she led me to a wooden chair and sat me down. She disappeared inside and returned with a bowl of thick, green oil and a loaf of bread that was still warm. She tore off a piece and handed it to me. "Faye," she commanded gently. "Eat." I took a bite. The bread was crusty and dense, the oil peppery and rich. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. It tasted of the earth that had nearly claimed me. I looked at Elena, who was now sitting on the step, shelling peas into a metal bowl. The rhythmic ping of the peas hitting the tin was the new heartbeat of my world. I realized then that my flight was over. I hadn't just found a place to hide. I had stumbled into a life that was as raw and honest as the trees. I had surrendered everything, my money, my status, my marriage, and finally my physical strength. And in that hollowed-out state, I had been found by a woman who saw me not for what I could provide or how I could reflect her glory, but as a human being in need of water and bread. The Boston lady was gone, buried under the roots of the silver grove. And as I sat there watching the shadows lengthen over the Aegean, I realized that for the first time in a decade, I wasn't waiting for a man to tell me it was time to leave. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The stars were still cold and sharp in the sky when Elena's hand shook my shoulder. In my previous life, 4:30 a.m. was a time I only saw if I was returning from a gala or catching a red-eye to Paris. Back then, the morning was greeted with an espresso and a silk robe. Here it was greeted by the scent of wood smoke, the distant braying of a donkey, and the damp chill of a stone floor. "Psychos," Elena whispered. "Get up." I dressed in the dark, pulling on a pair of oversized, faded canvas trousers and a thick cotton shirt that Elena had produced from a trunk. They smelled of cedar and thyme. As I laced up the heavy, oil-stained boots, a far cry from the $800 stilettos that now sat rotting in an Italian trash bin, I caught a glimpse of my hands. They were a disaster. My Boston lady hands, once meticulously manicured with ballerina pink polish and softened by expensive French creams, were now a map of trauma. The first week of work had shredded them. Angry, fluid-filled blisters had bloomed across my palms from the wooden handles of the rakes and the rough hemp of the laundry lines. My cuticles were jagged, stained with the indelible purple-black ink of the olives. But as I stepped out into the pre-dawn air, I didn't feel the urge to hide them. I felt a strange, quiet pride. These wounds were the first honest things I'd owned in years. The work began in the grove. Harvesting olives is not the romantic, sun-dappled pastime portrayed in travel magazines. It is rhythmic labor that demands every ounce of your structural integrity. Nikos, a man whose skin looked like a cured ham and whose silence was as vast as the sea, showed me how to spread the heavy emerald-colored nets beneath the trees. "Gentle Garcia," he'd say, his voice a low gravel. "The tree is old. She gives, but you do not take with violence." I learned to use the wooden rake to comb the branches, a repetitive motion that sent a shower of bitter, hard fruit raining down like green hail. Within 2 hours my shoulders were screaming. A dull, throbbing heat began at the base of my skull and radiated down my spine. Every muscle I had ever toned in a climate-controlled Pilates studio in Back Bay protested this new ancestral demand. Those studios had taught me how to look strong. The grove was teaching me how to be strong. By noon the sun was a golden hammer. Sweat didn't just bead on my skin. It poured, stinging my eyes and washing away the last lingering scent of my designer perfume. I felt the alchemy happening. The salt of my sweat was mixing with the dust of the Greek soil, creating a paste that coated my arms. It was a physical catharsis. Every time I swung the rake, I imagined I was striking at the memory of Gabriel's face. Every time I hauled a 50-pound sack of olives toward the tractor, I was dragging the weight of his expectations out of my soul. The physical ache was so intense, so demanding, that it left no room for the mental loops of betrayal. I was too tired to wonder what he was telling our friends. I was too exhausted to replay the fight at the cafe. The rot in my heart, the shame of being discarded, the grief of a wasted decade, was being squeezed out by the sheer pressure of the labor. My body was reclaiming the space that Gabriel had occupied. 3 weeks in, the change became undeniable. I was standing at the outdoor stone sink, scrubbing the day's grime from my forearms. I looked down and saw that the blisters had flattened, the skin underneath turning yellow and tough. My palms were becoming calloused. I ran a finger over the thickened skin and felt a jolt of electricity. I wasn't delicate anymore. I wasn't breakable. My body was shedding its refined softness. The designer curves I had maintained to please Gabriel's aesthetic, I were hardening into something sinewy and functional. I was losing weight, but I felt heavier, more grounded. When I caught my reflection in the small, mottled mirror in the hallway, I saw a stranger. Her skin was a deep sun-baked bronze. Her eyes, once clouded with the performative anxiety of the perfect hostess, were now clear and piercing. The Boston lady was dying, and I was the one burying her. I remembered a dinner party we'd hosted a year ago for a prestigious firm. I had spent 3 days obsessing over the centerpiece, making sure the lilies matched the napkins, making sure I laughed at the senior partner's jokes at exactly the right volume. Gabriel had pulled me aside mid-evening and whispered, "Don't talk too much about the technical specs of the project, Lexi. Just look beautiful and keep the wine flowing. That's your job." I had smiled and obeyed. I had made myself a ghost so he could be the sun. Now, sitting at the rough wooden table with Elena and Nikos, eating a bowl of lentils and dark bread, I realized I hadn't thought about that party in days. My job now was to ensure the harvest was clean, to tend to the chickens, and to help Elena boil the wild greens she gathered from the hillside. "You have the spirit of the mountain, Garcia," Elena said one evening, watching me massage my aching calves. "The city makes people soft like dough. The mountain makes them like stone." I looked at my hands, dirty, scarred, and strong. I thought about the ruby slipper lipstick still sitting in my bag. I realized I hadn't looked at it once. I didn't need a mask anymore. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was a spiritual shedding. I was no longer a decorative object in someone else's gallery. I was a participant in the world. The pain was real, the exhaustion was absolute, but the freedom was intoxicating. Gabriel had meant to teach me a lesson about my own worthlessness. He wanted me to realize that without his money and his name I was nothing. But as I lay down on my narrow bed that night, my muscles humming with a clean, honest fatigue, I realized he had failed. He hadn't left me with nothing. He had left me with the earth, the trees, and the strength of my own 2 hands. And as I drifted into a dreamless sleep, I knew that the woman who would eventually face Gabriel again wouldn't be the one he left behind. She would be someone forged in the fire of the Greek sun and the salt of her own sweat. And she would be formidable. The kitchen was a cathedral of flour, wood smoke, and sunlight. It was a space that demanded an honesty I hadn't practiced in years. In Boston, my kitchen had been a sterile showroom of brushed stainless steel and marble. A place where cooking meant following a 3-page recipe from a Michelin-starred chef to ensure the presentation was flawless for Gabriel's colleagues. There, a spill was a crisis. A burnt roast was a personal failing that Gabriel would reference with a sigh for weeks. Here, under Elena's watchful, honey-colored eyes, the kitchen was unrefined and alive. There were no measuring cups, no digital scales, no timers. There was only the feel of the dough, the scent of the yeast, and the ancient blackened stone oven that breathed heat like a sleeping dragon. "Zaimi," Elena said, patting a mound of dough that looked like a soft, pale cloud. "Knead. With the heart, Garcia. Not just the fingers." I stepped forward, my hands now calloused and stained, sinking into the cool, elastic mass. In the beginning I was terrible at it. I was too tentative, too afraid of breaking the bread. I was used to being an accessory, a woman who existed to complement the architecture of her husband's life, not someone who created something from the raw elements of the earth. "Stronger," Elena urged, her own hands moving in a blur of practiced rhythmic labor. I pushed. I pulled. I folded. And for the first time I felt the resistance of the gluten, the life force of the grain. But when it came time to bake, I failed. I misjudged the heat of the stone oven. Within 20 minutes, the fragrant scent of baking bread turned into the acrid, biting stench of carbonized hope. I pulled the loaves out with the long wooden paddle, my heart sinking. They were black, charred husks, as hard as the stones in the grove. I stood there, the smoke stinging my eyes, waiting for the lecture. I waited for the sharp, disappointed tongue of a man like Gabriel, Who would have categorized this as another example of your lack of focus? Elena walked over, looked at the blackened ruins, and did something that nearly broke me. She laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was a bright musical sound that bounced off the stone walls. She picked up one of the burnt loaves, cracked it open with a sharp snap, and peered at the steaming white center that had survived the fire. Too much fire, she said, shrugging. The oven is like a man, Garcia. Sometimes he is too hot, and you must wait for him to cool before you trust him with your heart. She handed me a piece of the soft white interior. Eat. The crust is for the birds. The center is for us. In that moment, a humbling joy washed over me. It was the permission to fail. For 10 years, I had lived in a world where every mistake was a crack in the facade of the devices. I had been so busy being perfect that I had forgotten how to be a human in progress. Here in this smoke-filled kitchen, a burnt loaf wasn't a disaster. It was a lesson. It was a tax paid to the gods of learning. As the weeks bled into a month, the transformation shifted from my hands to my head. My English, once my only weapon, began to recede, replaced by a rudimentary jagged Greek. Learning a new language at 34 is an exercise in profound vulnerability. You are reduced to the vocabulary of a toddler. You cannot be clever. You cannot be sarcastic. You can only be honest. I want water. I would stammer, my tongue tripping over the unfamiliar vowels. The sun is beautiful, I would say to Nikos, feeling the absurdity of such a simple thought. In Boston, I had used language as a shield. I was eloquent. I was well-spoken. I used complex sentences to hide the fact that I was dying inside. But here, stripped of my verbal finery, I had to connect through the eyes, through the hands, through the shared silence of a meal. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with Elena, our laps full of green beans that needed stringing. I was trying to tell her about my life before, about the design firm, the tall buildings, the glass and steel. But I didn't have the words for interior architecture or mid-century modern. Before, I said, struggling, I make houses pretty, but not home. Elena stopped her work. She looked at me, her face a map of weathered grace. She reached out and touched my chest, right over my heart. Home is not the stone, Garcia. Home is the fire. I felt a sob catch in my throat. It was so simple, so devastatingly true. Gabriel had built a house of the finest stone, but he had never allowed a fire to burn in it. He wanted a museum, not a home. He wanted a curator, not a wife. As I sat there, the air fragrant with the smell of drying herbs and the sea salt, I realized that I was no longer stranded. You are only stranded if you are waiting to be found by someone else. If you are building your own fire, you are exactly where you need to be. I looked at my hands again. They were dirty. They were scarred. But they were mine. They knew how to rake a grove, how to milk a goat, and finally, how to bake a loaf of bread that was golden and perfect. That night, for the first time, I spoke a full sentence to Nikos without stuttering. I asked him about the history of the trees we were tending. He talked for an hour, his voice a low, comforting rumble, and even though I only understood half the words, I understood the soul of the story. I was no longer a stranger watching a movie of someone else's life. I was becoming a thread in the tapestry of the village. The feeling of belonging began to take root in the spaces where Gabriel's influence had evaporated. It was a quiet, sturdy thing. It didn't need a designer label or a prestigious zip code. It only needed the permission to be imperfect, to be a work in progress, and to find the joy in the burnt bread of life. I was Garcia. Just Garcia. And as I lay down that night, the smell of the day's work still clinging to my skin, I realized I hadn't thought about my wedding ring in weeks. The white circle on my finger was fading, being overtaken by a deep, healthy tan. The past was a different language, one I was slowly forgetting how to speak. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the Aegean a bruised velvet purple. Inside the farmhouse, the only sound was the rhythmic click-clack of Elena's knitting needles and the low, guttering hiss of a single beeswax candle. It was a world of organic sounds, wind, wood, and breath. And then there was the phone. It sat on the rough-hewn wooden nightstand in my room, a sleek black slab of glass and titanium that looked like an alien artifact in this ancient space. For months it had been a dead thing, a paperweight buried at the bottom of my canvas bag. I had avoided it the way one avoids a grave. But tonight, A strange, restless energy had taken hold of me. Perhaps it was the way the wind had shifted, bringing with it the scent of distant storms. Or perhaps I was simply tired of the silence. I plugged it into the small universal adapter Nikos had found for me weeks ago. The screen flickered to life, the bright sterile glow of the Apple logo cutting through the shadows like a surgical laser. Felt invasive. Felt wrong. Then the digital haunting began. The phone vibrated. A frantic staccato buzzing that didn't stop for 3 full minutes. Buzz, buzz, buzz. It was the sound of 1,000 ghosts screaming for my attention. Notifications flooded the screen. A relentless tide of blue and white bubbles. 342 unread messages. 118 missed calls. 94 emails. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering a hollow rhythm against my ribs. I felt a sudden sharp pang of guilt as I scrolled through the names. My mother. My college roommate Maya. My former design mentor Sarah. The early messages were frantic. Garcia, where are you? Gabriel said you had a breakdown in Italy, please call us. The police have a report, but no one has seen you. As I scrolled, the tone shifted. The frantic worry turned into a low, simmering confusion, and then eventually into a chilling, resigned silence. The last message from Maya was dated 2 months ago. I don't know what happened to you, G, but I hope you found whatever it was you were looking for. Goodbye. I had disappeared so thoroughly that I had become a ghost in my own life. I had left them all behind in the wake of Gabriel's cruelty, and the shame of that realization tasted like copper in my mouth. But then I saw the name that made the air in the room turn to ice. Gabriel Davis. There were only 3 messages from him in the beginning. None of them asked if I was safe. None of them expressed a single shred of remorse. This has gone far enough, Alexis. You're making a scene. The partners are asking questions. You're embarrassing me. Get to the consulate in Florence immediately. I'm leaving for Boston on Tuesday. If you aren't on that flight, don't bother coming back. I felt a ghost of a laugh escape my throat. Don't bother coming back. As if the prison door were being slammed from the inside. I opened my email app, my thumb trembling as I filtered for his name. There, at the very top, was an email sent only 6 hours ago. The subject line was a single clinical word, enough. Clicked it open. Alexis. It's taken months and a considerable amount of money. Private investigators aren't cheap, especially when they have to scour the backwaters of the Mediterranean, but I finally found you. That pathetic little farm in Greece? Really? It's a bit cliché, don't you think? This tantrum has lasted long enough. You've had your little eat, pray, love moment, and you've sufficiently damaged our reputation in Boston. People think I'm a monster, and I've had to spend far too much time managing the narrative. Your mother is currently under the impression you're on a sabbatical, but she's becoming difficult to control. I'm coming to collect you. My flight lands in Athens on Thursday. I'll be at that farmhouse by evening. Be packed and ready. I've already contacted a realtor about the brownstone. We're moving to the suburbs. Clearly, the city gave you too many ideas about independence. I know where you are, Alexis. Don't try to run again. It only makes you look more desperate. Gee. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the stone floor. I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. Instead, a wave of profound, bone-deep nausea washed over me. It wasn't the threat of his arrival that made my stomach churn. It was the predatory nature of his words. He hadn't searched for me because he missed my voice. He hadn't searched for me because he feared I was dead in a ditch in Italy. He had searched for me because my absence was a stain on his carefully curated image. He was a hunter tracking down a piece of escaped property that was reflecting poorly on its owner. To him, I wasn't a wife. I wasn't even a person. I was a line item in his portfolio of success. A supportive wife asset that had gone rogue and needed to be repossessed and relocated to a suburb, where the walls were thicker and the neighbors were quieter. I looked around my small whitewashed room. I saw the clay mug Nikos had helped me fire. I saw the bundle of dried sage hanging from the rafters. I smelled the honest, earthy scent of the olive oil still lingering on my skin. This world was real. It was hard, it was sun-scorched, and it was mine. Gabriel's world, the world of managing the narrative, of firm partners and sterile brownstones, felt like a fever dream I had finally woken up from. His email was a voice from a dead language, A desperate attempt to re-establish a power dynamic that no longer existed. "I know where you are," I whispered, the words feeling heavy and strange in the quiet room. "Yes, Gabriel. I know where I am too." I stood up, my legs feeling strong and steady beneath me. I didn't reach for the phone. I let it lie there on the floor, its screen still glowing with his sterile threats. I walked to the window and pushed open the shutters. The night air rushed in, cool, salt-tinged, and ancient. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of Thursday. I wasn't afraid of the silver sedan that would inevitably crawl up the dirt path. The cold indignation that had taken root in my chest was transforming into something else. Something sharper. Something final. Gabriel thought he was coming to collect a broken woman who would be grateful for his mercy. He thought he was coming to rescue a puppy that had wandered too far from its leash. He had no idea that the woman he left in Italy had died in that silver grove. The woman who was waiting for him now was forged from Greek stone and olive wood. She didn't need his money, she didn't need his name, and she certainly didn't need his map. I looked back at the phone. The battery was at 12%. I didn't plug it back in. I watched as the light dimmed, then flickered and finally went black. The ghost was back in the machine. And for the first time in 10 years the machine was silent. I walked back to the bed and lay down, the sound of the Aegean humming in the distance like a promise. Tomorrow I would tell Elena. Tomorrow I would speak to the village lawyer. But tonight I would sleep. Because on Thursday I wasn't going to be collected. I was going to be the one to finally elegantly set us both on fire. The morning after Gabriel's digital intrusion did not bring the panic he surely intended. Instead it brought a strange crystalline silence. I woke before the rooster, my mind working with a precision I hadn't felt since my early days at the firm. I wasn't just Garcia the survivor anymore. I was Garcia the architect of her own escape. I found Elena and Nikos on the porch, the steam from their thick Greek coffee curling into the cool dawn air. They looked at me and I knew they saw the change. The Boston lady was gone. The ghost had been exorcised. I sat with them and in my jagged but steady Greek, I told them about the man in the silver car. I told them about the collection scheduled for Thursday. Elena didn't blink. She merely set her cup down with a deliberate clink against the stone. "He comes for a bird in a cage," she said, her voice like grinding millstones. "But there is no cage here, Garcia. Only the grove." Nikos stood up, his joints creaking like the ancient olive branches. He beckoned me to follow him to the small, whitewashed outbuilding where the oil was stored. Inside it smelled of green gold and cool shadows. He pointed to the rows of stainless steel vats, then out toward the hills where 200 years of legacy stood rooted in the limestone. "We have no children to take the rakes when our hands fail," Nikos said, his English slow but ironclad. "We have the land, but the land needs a future. You have the eye for the future. You see the beauty in the fruit, not just the price." He reached into a wooden chest and pulled out a stack of documents, thick with the scent of old ink and government stamps. "Katerina, the lawyer in the village. She has prepared these. Not for a guest. For a partner." The weight of the offer hit me with the force of a tectonic shift. They weren't just offering me a job, they were offering me an anchor. For 10 years my home had been a revocable privilege. Gabriel reminded me of it every time I spent too much on a gala dress or questioned a business decision. "This is my house, Lexi. My name is on the deed. My sweat paid for these walls." I had lived on the surface of his life, a tenant in my own marriage. But here on this dusty Greek hillside, I was being invited to graft my life onto something eternal. Over the next 3 days while the clock ticked toward Gabriel's arrival, I didn't pack. I designed. I sat at the rough wooden table with my old iPad, the one piece of technology one hadn't discarded, and I brought my professional self back from the dead. I designed the branding for our premium oil. I called it Nostos, the ancient Greek word for homecoming. I used my eye for minimalist luxury to create a label that honored the unrefined beauty of Elena's grove. I was no longer an accessory to an architect's ego. I was the visionary for a legacy. On Wednesday afternoon, we walked into the village to see Katerina. Her office was a small room filled with the scent of jasmine and the sound of a ceiling fan struggling against the heat. There were no glass-walled conference rooms, No assistants in charcoal suits. There was only a woman with sharp eyes and a cigarette she didn't light, who looked at me not as a displaced wife, but as a business partner. You understand what this means, Garcia? Katerina asked, her voice a low rasp. In Greece, land is not just dirt. It is blood. By signing this, you are no longer a tourist. You are an owner. You have rights that no man from America can overrule. Picked up the pen. My hand was steady, the calluses on my palms providing a grip that my soft Boston hands never had. As I signed my name, I felt a profound sense of rebirth. The ink was black and permanent. It was an ironclad declaration of my existence. Garcia, partner. When the papers were stamped and the seals applied, Elena reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin felt like the bark of the trees we tended, and for the first time in my life, I knew what it meant to belong to something that couldn't be taken away. I wasn't an extra in Gabriel's play anymore. I was the protagonist of my own. We walked back to the farm as the sun began its descent. The Aegean was a sheet of beaten silver, and the grove was alive with the sound of the evening wind. I stopped at the edge of our land, and looked at the dirt road that snaked up from the coast. Tomorrow the silver sedan would arrive. Gabriel would step out in his tailored chinos and his designer sunglasses, ready to forgive me for my tantrum. He would bring his condescension, his checklists, and his belief that he could simply reclaim what he had discarded. He would expect to find the woman who cried in the Italian cafe. He would expect to find the woman who folded under the weight of his disapproval. He wouldn't find her. He would find a woman with dirt under her fingernails and the deed to a 1,000-year-old legacy in her heart. He would find a woman who had used the very stones he threw at her to build a fortress. Are you afraid, Garcia? Nikos asked as we reached the porch. I looked at my hands, the hands that had raked the grove, baked the bread, and signed the documents of my own freedom. I thought about the white circle of skin where my wedding ring used to be. It was almost gone now, tanned over by the Greek sun, healed by the salt of the sea. No, I said, and the word felt like an anchor dropping into the deep. I'm not afraid. I'm ready. That night, I didn't sleep in the narrow bed of a guest. I slept in the room of a partner. The Boston lady was a memory, a story told in a language I no longer cared to speak. Gabriel thought he was coming to end a ridiculous tantrum. He didn't realize he was coming to witness a rebirth. The roots of the olive trees go deep, deeper than the resentment of a small man. They can survive fires, droughts, and centuries of neglect. And like those trees, I had finally found the soil that wouldn't let me go. Thursday was coming, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't the one who was lost. Gabriel was. He just didn't know it yet. The sound of the engine reached the farm before the car did, a low mechanical hum that was entirely foreign to the rhythmic silence of the grove. It wasn't the rattling, honest thrum of Nikos's old tractor, or the distant buzz of a village Vespa. This was the sound of precision, of expensive German engineering, and it felt like a serrated blade cutting through the warm afternoon air. I was in the processing shed, my hands deep in a wooden bin of freshly harvested olives, sorting the green gold from the bruised. I didn't stop. I didn't let my heart skip a beat. I simply waited. The silver sedan appeared at the mouth of the dirt track, a shimmering artificial invader against the burnt umber of the Greek hillside. It moved slowly, tentatively, its low profile struggling with the ruts and stones that the earth had spent centuries placing there. A cloud of fine white dust trailed behind it like a ghost. As it pulled into the yard, the metallic glint of the sunlight off its polished hood was blinding, a stark contrast to the matte, weathered textures of the stone farmhouse and the silver-green leaves of the trees. The engine cut out. For a moment there was only the sound of the cicadas, louder now, as if they were screaming at the interloper. The door opened and Gabriel stepped out. He looked like a man who had been rendered in a different resolution than the rest of the world. He was dressed in tailored cream-colored chinos and a crisp, navy linen shirt that probably cost more than the village's monthly grocery bill. His hair was perfectly coiffed, held in place by a product that smelled of sandalwood and hubris. Even his sunglasses, oversized dark aviators, seemed designed to shield him from the very reality of the sun. He stood there for a moment, his lip curling in a familiar, condescending sneer as he surveyed the backwater he had been forced to visit. He looked at the peeling whitewash of the house, the rusted farm tools leaning against the wall, and the chickens scratching in the dirt with a visible, shuddering distaste. "Alexis," he called out. His voice was the same melodic, authoritative, the voice of a man accustomed to being the loudest person in a room. But here, beneath the vast, indifferent Greek sky, it sounded thin. It sounded small. I stepped out of the shed. I didn't wipe the dust from my face. I didn't smooth my hair, which was pulled back in a practical sweat-stained kerchief. I stood there in my heavy boots and my canvas trousers, my arms bare and browned by months of labor, my hands still stained with the dark, indelible ink of the olive. Gabriel's eyes traveled over me, and I watched the shock register on his face, followed quickly by a wave of profound, clinical disgust. He didn't see the strength in my shoulders or the clarity in my gaze. He saw damage. "My God, Alexis," he whispered, his voice dripping with a stark contrast of pity and anger. "Look at you. What have you done to yourself?" I walked toward him, my boots crunching on the gravel with a steady, purposeful weight. I didn't stop until I was well within his personal space, forcing him to smell the honesty of my sweat against the artificial scent of his cologne. "I've lived, Gabriel," I said. My voice was different now, lower, steadier, stripped of the breathless anxiety that used to haunt my every word. "I've worked. I've become someone you don't have a map for." He reached out, his hand hovering near my arm as if he wanted to touch a bruise to see if it was real, but he pulled back at the last second, his fingers twitching. Your sun damaged. Your hands. They're ruined. We'll need to see a specialist in Boston. We can fix this, Lexi. I've booked a suite at the Grande Bretagna in Athens for tonight. They have a world-class spa. We'll get you cleaned up, and we can forget this ever happened. The sharp detachment I felt in that moment was breathtaking. I looked at him, this man I had once worshipped, this man whose approval had been the sun I orbited, and I saw a pathetic stranger. I saw a man who believed that a spa treatment could erase a soul's awakening. I saw a man who was so terrified of the unrefined world that he had to carry his own sterile bubble with him wherever he went. He wasn't an architect of buildings, he was an architect of facades. And his own facade was beginning to crack under the Greek sun. "I'm not going to Athens, Gabriel," I said, my voice as hard as the limestone beneath our feet. "And I'm certainly not going to Boston." His face darkened, the charming husband mask slipping to reveal the petulant, controlling child beneath. "Don't be ridiculous. This tantrum has cost me enough time and money. Do you have any idea how much it cost to find you? The investigators, the flights. You owe me, Alexis. You owe me for the embarrassment you've caused." "I owe you nothing," I countered. "You left me in Italy. You drove away laughing. You forfeited your seat at my table the moment you decided my dignity was a punchline." He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me, a tactic that had worked for a decade. But I didn't move. I felt the presence of Elena and Nikos behind me, standing in the shadows of the porch, silent, watchful guardians who didn't need to speak to offer their strength. "This isn't you," Gabriel hissed, his eyes darting to the farmhouse with loathing. This manual labor, this poverty, it's beneath you. You're the wife of Gabriel Davis. You belong in a boardroom at a gallery, in a home that isn't made of dirt." I looked at him then, truly looked at him, and I realized why I had been so afraid of him for so long. It wasn't because he was powerful. It was because he was empty. He had spent his whole life building monuments to his own ego, and he couldn't understand a world where value was measured in the health of a tree or the taste of bread. "You're right about one thing, Gabriel," I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "This isn't the Alexis you knew. She died on a street in Italy. She was a ghost, a shadow you cast. The woman standing here? She owns this land. She is a partner in this business. She speaks a language you will never understand." I reached into the pocket of my trousers and pulled out a small, heavy envelope. It wasn't the silk scarf he'd expected or the tearful apology he'd planned for. It was the irrevocable end of his reign. "These are the divorce papers, Gabriel, prepared by a Greek lawyer, translated into English. I've already signed them." He stared at the envelope as if I were holding a live snake. The stark contrast between his polished, tailored world and this raw, visceral reality was finally complete. The architect had arrived to find that his masterpiece had walked off the canvas and built her own world. "You're insane," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You'd throw away everything? The brownstone? The accounts? My name." "Your name was a shackle," I said, stepping back, the sharp detachment finally turning into a cold, triumphant peace. "And your house was a tomb. I'd rather have dirt under my fingernails and a soul that breathes than spend one more second as an ornament in your life." I dropped the envelope at his feet. It landed in the white dust, a pristine, sterile thing in a world that had no use for it. "The road back to Athens is long, Gabriel, and you're blocking the delivery truck." I turned my back on him then. I didn't wait for his reply. I didn't wait for the inevitable explosion of his ego. I walked back toward the shed, toward the smell of the olives and the sound of the cicadas. I walked back toward my life. Behind me I heard the sound of the car door slamming. A sharp final sound. The engine roared, the tires spinning in the dirt, throwing up a cloud of dust that obscured the silver sedan as it retreated down the hill. I didn't look back. I picked up a handful of olives, their skin cool and firm against my calloused palm. The architect was gone, and for the first time in my life the blueprint was mine. The dust from Gabriel's departure did not settle quickly. It hung in the heavy, golden air of the afternoon, a fine white veil of limestone and grit that coated the silver leaves of the olive trees. I stood at the edge of the dirt track, watching the silver sedan shrink into a shimmering speck, a glitch in the landscape that was finally being deleted. The roar of his engine, so full of impotent rage, was eventually swallowed by the ancient, indifferent silence of the hills. I looked down at the spot where the envelope had rested. He had picked it up at the last second, a reflex of a man who couldn't stand to leave a paper trail of his own defeat. But the impact of it, the irrevocable weight of those signatures remained. "Pame," Elena whispered from behind me. "Come." I turned to see her and Nikos. They weren't smiling with the boisterous joy of a victory. Their expressions were solemn, anchored in a deep, ancestral understanding of what it cost to break a chain. Nikos stepped forward and placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. His skin felt like sun-baked earth, a stark contrast to the sterile, cold touch I had endured for a decade. He didn't need to say anything. In this village, silence was the highest form of respect. We walked back toward the house. My legs felt strangely light, as if the gravity of my former life had finally lost its grip. For years I had moved through the world with a calculated grace, every step measured to ensure I didn't trip over Gabriel's ego. Now my boots crunched into the dirt with a messy, beautiful autonomy. Inside the kitchen the light was soft, filtered through the vines that clung to the stone walls. Elena moved to the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of ouzo, the clear liquid shimmering like a promise. She poured 3 small glasses. "To the woman who died," she said in Greek, her eyes locking onto mine with a piercing triumph. "To the woman who was born," Nikos added, his voice a low vibration in the small room. We drank. The liquid was fire and anise, a sharp, cleansing burn that seemed to cauterize the last of the wounds. As I set the glass down, I realized that the luxury Gabriel had tried to lure me back with, the cashmere wraps, the seasonal galas, the 5-star silences, felt like a collection of plastic trinkets. He had offered me the world, but he had forgotten that I was the one who had been holding it up for him. I walked to the small mirror in the hallway, the same one where I had once seen a stranger. I looked at myself now. The tan was deep, a bronze armor forged by the sun. My hair was wind-tousled and unapologetic, but it was my eyes that stopped me. The accessory was gone. The woman who looked back at me had agency. She was the architect now, and she was no longer interested in building facades. "I gave him the carcass of a marriage," I said softly, the English words feeling heavy in the quiet kitchen. I thought about the divorce papers. They weren't just a legal filing, they were an autopsy report. They detailed the death of a partnership that had never truly been one. Gabriel had seen our marriage as a structure to be managed, a brand to be maintained. I saw it now for what it was. A hollow shell, beautiful on the outside but filled with the dry rot of control. By handing him those papers in the dirt, I hadn't just ended a contract. I had performed a final act of severance. I spent that evening in a state of quiet, vibrating peace. I walked through the grove, touching the trunks of the trees that were now partially mine. I thought about the permission to breathe, I had mentioned to Gabriel. It wasn't a metaphor. For 10 years, I had inhaled only as much air as he allowed me to take. I had monitored my own lungs, ensuring I didn't take up too much space, didn't sigh too loudly, didn't gasp at the beauty of a world he didn't control. Tonight I breathed. The air tasted of salt, wild thyme, and freedom. As the moon rose, casting long skeletal shadows of the olive branches across the silver grass, I felt the final emotional shedding. It was a physical sensation, a shivering off of old skin. I remembered the gala in Boston where Gabriel had corrected my posture in front of the mayor. I remembered the quiet talks in the car where he explained why my ideas for the new firm branding were too emotional. I gathered those memories like dead leaves and let the wind of the Aegean carry them away. I was no longer the supportive wife. I was no longer the abandoned woman. I was Garcia. I sat on the porch steps, the stone still radiating the day's heat. I looked at my hands, the hands Gabriel had called ruined. I saw the calluses, the scars, and the strength. These hands had built a partnership in a foreign tongue. These hands had harvested fruit that would feed people I didn't know. These hands had signed a document that declared my life was my own. I wasn't damaged. I was refined by fire. Nikos came out and sat a few feet away, smoking his pipe in the dark. The cherry of the tobacco glowed like a small grounded star. Tomorrow, he said, we press the premium oil. The Nostos. Yes, I replied, my voice steady and clear. Tomorrow we begin. The revenge wasn't in the divorce papers. It wasn't in the sharp words I had used to cut through his ego. The revenge was the fact that I was going to be happy. I was going to thrive in a world he couldn't buy, speaking a language he couldn't hear, rooted in a soil he was too afraid to touch. Gabriel would go back to Boston and tell a story of a woman who lost her mind. He would fill the halls of our brownstone with new furniture, and perhaps a new, more compliant accessory. But he would always know, in the quiet dark of his sterile bedroom, that he had met a force he couldn't dominate. He would know that I didn't need him to find north. I had become the compass. I stood up and looked at the horizon where the sea met the sky. The darkness was total, but I wasn't afraid. I had my own light now, and it was irrevocable. The dust from Gabriel's retreat finally settled, returning to the ancient earth from which it had been disturbed. The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating hush of that first night in Italy. It was a luminescent stillness, a vibrant quiet that felt like the world holding its breath in approval. I stood at the edge of the dirt track, my feet planted firmly in the soil, watching the last of the afternoon sun catch the silver undersides of the olive leaves. They flickered like 1,000 tiny mirrors, reflecting a light that Gabriel's polished world could never replicate. I turned back toward the farmhouse. Elena and Nikos were waiting for me on the porch, their silhouettes etched against the whitewashed stone. They didn't offer platitudes or ask how I felt. They simply opened the door. A silent invitation back into a life I had earned with the sweat of my brow and the hardening of my soul. The next morning the air was crisp, carrying the scent of the sea and the promise of the first true harvest of Nostos. The pressing house was alive with the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the mill. In Boston, production was something that happened in distant factories, managed by spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Here it was visceral. I stood by the stainless steel vats, watching the first stream of oil emerge. It wasn't just a commodity. It was liquid gold, a vibrant, peppery green that seemed to glow from within. This was the result of the alchemy of the last year, the transmutation of my grief into something nourishing, something unyielding. I dipped a piece of Elena's crusty bread into the fresh oil and tasted it. The flavor was explosive, earthy, bright, and sharp. It tasted of the limestone hills, the salt spray of the Aegean, and the resilience of trees that had survived centuries of change. Is good? Nikos asked, his eyes crinkling as he watched me. It's perfect, I whispered, the word catching in a throat that no longer felt tight with unsaid apologies. It's home. Over the following weeks, the Nostos brand began its life. I had used my design background not to create a mask, but to tell a story. The labels were simple, elegant, and bore the names of Elena, Nikos, and Garcia. When the first crates were loaded onto the truck for the markets in Athens and beyond, I felt a sense of serene permanence. My value was no longer tied to the man I stood next to at a gala. It was tied to the fertile ground I tended and the quality of the work I produced. One evening, after the last of the harvest had been bottled and the grove was settling into its winter slumber, I walked out to the very spot where I had collapsed months ago. The silver trees stood like sentinels in the twilight, their twisted trunks a testament to the beauty of enduring. I sat on a flat stone, my hands resting in my lap. I looked at them, my ruined hands. They were brown, scarred, and strong. The white circle where my wedding ring had been was gone, completely erased by the Greek sun. In its place was a soul that felt expanded, as vast as the horizon before me. I thought back to that night in Italy, the sound of the car door slamming, the taunting laughter of Pete and Marco, the sight of Gabriel's taillights disappearing into the dark. For months I had viewed that moment as the ultimate betrayal, the ultimate cruelty. I had called myself stranded. But as I sat there, bathed in the luminescent glow of the rising moon, I realized that being stranded was the greatest gift I had ever been given. If Gabriel had been kind, I would still be in Boston, slowly suffocating in a life of silk and silence. If he had been a good husband, I would still be making myself smaller to fit into the spaces he left for me. His cruelty had been the knife that cut the tether. His abandonment had been the gale that blew me toward the only place I could truly grow. He hadn't left me to die. He had accidentally forced me to live. The supportive wife had been a delicate hothouse flower, dependent on the artificial climate of someone else's approval. But the woman I was now? I was an olive tree. I was unyielding. I could survive the drought of loneliness and the heat of betrayal, and I would still yield fruit. I had found a fertile ground not just in the Greek soil, but within myself. A sense of absolute peace settled over me, a tranquility so deep it felt as though it were rooted in the very bedrock of the island. I wasn't waiting for a call. I wasn't checking a phone for a status update. I wasn't wondering if I was enough. I was home. I stood up and started the walk back to the farmhouse. I saw the light in the kitchen window, a warm amber glow that promised a meal with people who saw me, who valued me, and who respected the strength I had found. I thought about the word nostos, homecoming. It had taken being abandoned in a foreign land for me to finally arrive at the only home that ever mattered, my own skin. Gabriel's car had vanished into the dust long ago, and with it, the woman who needed his permission to breathe. I took a deep lung-filling breath of the cool night air, the scent of wild thyme and ancient earth filling my chest. I wasn't stranded. I was planted. And as I stepped onto the porch and into the warmth of the house, I knew that no matter what storms the future might bring, my roots were deep, my spirit was free, and the harvest would always be mine. Thank you for walking this long emotional path with me today. It is a humble reminder that even when we are discarded by those we trust, the earth still holds a place for us to bloom. If Garcia's journey touched a chord in your heart, I would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of resilience inspire me more than words can say. And if you found strength in these chapters, please consider subscribing to Queen's Revenge. Let's grow stronger together.